Every race car origin story is different. There are some based around the pursuit of lifelong dreams, some based around the exploration of concepts no one else has ever tried, and some based around an auto industry supplier and a model car company getting together to promote plastic while also building one of the fastest and most innovative funny cars of the 1960s. Yeah, this is the story of the last one of those. As we've explored in other videos, the middle 60s, specifically from about 1965 through 1968, were the most awesome Wild West era for funny car drag racing one could ever imagine. The different bodies used, the different chassis, the layouts, the experiments, stuff changed every week, but the one thing that didn't was the fans that showed up each and every racetrack and each and every event wherever the newest and fastest freak of the week was appearing. Now, after seeing the first couple images and what we have going on here, you may be already questioning the idea about the AMT Piranha of actually being a funny car by its traditional definition, but understand one thing. This car was an absolute performance beast, and it had a load of interesting period technology in it, and boy did the whole thing work really well. But before we get into the whole 95% nitro, Hemi, tire smoking part, we have to talk about where this thing came from, and that's a story in and unto itself. So first, the industrial side of the Piranha. Marbon Chemical was a division of the massive Borg-Warner conglomerate back in the day. Now, of course, people know Borg-Warner for such things as the Indy 500 trophy, driveline parts like the T10 transmission, turbochargers, and a whole lot more. Well, in the middle 60s, Marbon was pioneering an engineering angle with plastics that seemed to have a lot of promise in the future, specifically in the automotive industry. They had a product called Cycolac, which was a form of what is most commonly referred to today as ABS plastic. Now, I'd go into the meaning of ABS plastic, but that's not really the point of this whole thing, and I am not a chemist. So Marbon was killing it with Cycolac and a lot of different household appliances like telephones, for instance. Millions of them every year were made of the product. Loads of appliances used this stuff, and millions of people interacted with it every day. It could be made cheaply, formed easily, and it had all the right characteristics to be useful for a very long time. The stuff was strong, light, durable, and most importantly, it was very easy to manipulate, and it was cheap to make. The management team at Marbon had been handed a big task by the parent company, and that was to get their product, Cycolac, into the auto industry. Since after all, ABS could be used to do basically everything steel could do within reason, and a lot of times ABS was better at it. The stuff was cheaper to obtain, cheaper to manipulate into different shapes, had many of the same characteristics as thin sheet metal and car bodies, and could never rot. Borg-Warner and Marbon wanted to get into the car body business on a large scale, and yes, they had already done stuff like dashboards, and in 1966, Pontiac used the stuff for their grills, but they wanted a whole lot larger slice of the industry than that. So after what were probably several three-martini lunches, the Marbon executives decided to do something bold. They were going to build some cars to show off just how good Cycolac could do the job. But how in the heck were they going to do that? They were a plastics company. So the good thing about giant industrial conglomerates is that you typically have a lot of talented people buried in your ranks. Borg-Warner looked internally and found Dan Deaver, a highly talented industrial engineer and designer who just so happened to be the development director at Borg-Warner's Centaur Engineering Division. And Centaur just so happened to be into all kinds of advanced projects, including race car stuff. So this was a natural fit. The Cycolac Research Vehicle Program was born. Deaver came up with a beautiful and sleek design for a rear-engine car which would use a Corvair powertrain. The machine was sporty and it was cool looking on paper, and in renderings it looked fantastic. But how would it look when it was actually made? The answer? Pretty awesome. The very first car, called CRV-1, remember, Cycolac Research Vehicle, was built using a Centaur Engineering tube steel frame as its underpinning. The second car, made in 1965, was CRV-2, and that was a race car which used a plastic body, a fiberglass frame structure, and metal reinforcement points where the suspension bolted on. This was, incidentally, a very successful race car that actually won some SCCA competitions that year. The third car built, CRV-3, now that was using government crash testing, and frankly didn't fare that well. The CRV-4 was completed in early 1966, had a beautiful windshield, a curved roof, the windows that were gull-wing opening, and doors that opened normally. CRV-5 was a coupe, and both 4 and 5 were sent to Europe for auto shows and promotion through 1966. And this is probably where the story would have ended. After making the 5 CRVs, someone stood up and reminded the folks at Marbon that the idea was not to become a car maker, but rather to sell plastic to the car makers. No more CRVs. The first ever plastic cars in the world were effectively dead in the water. And then, a company making far, far too much money got wind of the project. By the middle 1960s, the AMT Model Company had sold over 100 million model kits to kids across the world, and they were swimming in cash. So much so that they created a new AMT Speed and Custom Equipment division of the company in Phoenix, Arizona. Don Beebe was the general manager. And if you've watched previous videos and have a keen mind, you'll remember Beebe's name because he was involved in some very high-level programs I've spoken about before. Working for Ford, he coordinated and executed their Cavalcade of Custom Cars tour that rolled around the nation in the early 60s, and then while working for Dodge in 1964, he created the Dodge Chargers drag racing program, which some believe in effect created the first funny cars. The machines may have broken down frequently, but Beebe's Dodge Chargers program was a massive success in the media and drew thousands and thousands of young potential car buyers to the drag strip. So, Beebe, having his promotional flair, somehow got wind of this project, and now he had the keys to this particular candy store. The design director at AMT was Gene Winfield, the renowned custom car builder, creator, and painter extraordinaire. Between the two of them, their job was to create vehicles that AMT could promote as models, and then full-size versions they could sell for large sums. Now, they were not only bringing the models to life, but they were also providing ideas for the modelers to expand their catalog. And as you'll learn, these are just two men that were part of an amazing, amazing cast of talent. Sometime in 1966, AMT bought the rights to the CRV. Now, this meant that Marbon would supply the bodies and fiberglass chassis to the specs of AMT, and AMT would handle building the cars. It was the exact arrangement Marbon wanted to get into, but perhaps in a far, far lower volume than they had wished. Either way, we had a body maker, we had custom car builders, and we had a couple of design tweaks. Gene Winfield and Sam Foose, yes, the father of Chip Foose, were the primary guys on the design and finishing of these early cars. Needing a cooler name than CRV, they decided on Piranha. Knowing that they had to promote these things hard and that the road-going car with its Corvair Flat 6 would be cool, but maybe not a headline maker, they decided to build a pair of race cars to start with. The first was a road racing machine owned and driven by Dick Carbajal. Not only did it look awesome, carry the Piranha name, and function well, Carbajal was a wheelman, and the car could actually run up front and win. The second race car was to be far, far different. It would be the Piranha Funny Car. Undoubtedly, Don Beebe had some influence here as he saw the Dodge Charger program capture the youth of America firsthand just a few years prior, and funny car fever had taken the nation by storm. So the team on the car was led by 24-year-old Fred Smith. Smith, who straight from high school in 1958, joined on with Don Garlitz and became one of his most trusted fabricators and right-hand men, was a phenom. He had built the car that Ed Garlitz won the 1961 AHRA Top Gas Championship with, worked elbow to elbow with Big, and was a truly creative talent. Joe Anahory, the former lead wrench for the famed Dead End Kids Top Fuel team from Brooklyn, New York, was tapped as the engine builder and crew chief. Jim Johnson, who was one of the team drivers for the Dodge Chargers project in '64, was on the crew. Walt Stevens was the chosen driver. Additionally, guys like Bill Robertson, Vic Bizzanelli, Mike Rubinar all helped. And interestingly, Andrea DiStefanis, who was listed as a factory Maserati designer from Italy, also received some credit for working on the funny car. Because the road-going and road racing Piranhas were rear engine in the traditional sense, meaning the engine is actually behind the rear axle, the crew at AMT wanted to mimic that layout as much as they could. Now, this meant it would be, remember in drag racing terminology, a back-motored funny car. Obviously, the proper term here is mid-engine because the motor sits behind the driver but in front of the axle, but for drag racers and drag racing terminology, anytime the engine is behind the driver, it's considered a rear-engine car. Don't go blaming me, that's how people have described this stuff since the 50s, so I'm just following the company line. Now, Fred Smith made the chassis out of 1 3/8 as well as 3/4-inch chromoly steel tubing. The whole chassis weighed 68 pounds by itself. The car uses a 120-inch wheelbase, and in the front, a drop axle was used with 4.5 inches of drop. It used Anglia spindles on the ends, and the front suspension was a torsion bar setup that Smith had made himself from scratch. A PS Machine dragster steering box was mounted up front, along with 4-inch wide, 15-inch diameter wheels used for the front runners. Extensive use of magnesium, aluminum, and titanium was made in the areas that were not of structural importance to keep the weight down. How well did that work? You'll find out in a minute. The car had a 56-inch track width up front, and as you can see, the cockpit was wide open, with Stevens having plenty of room to operate in there. Claustrophobia was not going to be an issue here in the Piranha, even if he was a sufferer. Out back, things got very interesting. The engine, which we'll get into the details of in a minute, was a 392 Hemi taken out to 396 inches. The transmission? There wasn't one. This was a direct drive car using a 2-disc clutch and a Donovan Engineering bell housing. In an interesting nod to the future, the car used a driveline coupler like a modern Top Fuel or funny car would use, not any sort of universal joint. The engine, at Smith's behest, was mounted with 8 degrees of rake and coupled to a 1960 Olds rear end that used either 323 or 343 gearing depending on the day and the conditions when the car was being run. Goodyear or M&H 11-inch slicks were used to try to get all the power to the ground on the back of the car. Now, Joe Anahori's handiwork was fantastic in the engine. A 392 with a light bore job of 30 thousandths to bring it to 396 cubic inches was 671 blown, ran on 95% nitromethane, and before taking the lead engine building job at AMT's Custom Equipment Division, Joe was at Mylodon Engineering in California, so he knew his way around a Hemi, front, back, and sideways. The starting point for the build was a 1958 vintage 392 Hemi. Its 4-inch bore was taken to 403. Now, the stock stroke was kept, and the engine had a Mylodon bottom end girdle to stiffen things up down that part of the world. The bottom of the block was also notched to clear the big, beefy Mickey Thompson aluminum rods. Mickey Thompson pistons were used, along with power lock and seal power piston rings, and both an Engel and Crowler cam were spec'd by the team, and they were used in testing and in the lead and backup engines to see which one made more power and which one made the car faster. The 671 blower is from Don Hampton. Joe Mondello worked the cylinder heads, and the fuel was fed to the engine with an Enderley injector that had additional port nozzles. The compression ratio was 7.2 to 1, and Fred Smith built the Zumi headers. Now, the Zumi headers were interesting in the fact that guys still ran water in their blocks at this point. Sometimes that water would boil over and get on the track or on the tires. Smith devised a program where any excess water would actually leak into the Zumi, where he surmised it would vaporize into steam on contact. Now, I'm not sure any other car in drag racing history used this technology, and whether it worked or not, I don't know, but this one never seemed to suffer from it in terms of the car's performance. It was a novel idea, and assuming the volume of water was low enough, when it hit a red-hot header pipe, Smith's theory was likely going to be proved out. Next up was the body. Gene Winfield, and I'm guessing the guy from Maserati, were on the job here. They altered the normal street-going Piranha spec some, lengthening this body by some 10 inches to make it all fit properly and look good. Another alteration was to make the body a little thinner than usual. Typically, the Cycolac cars had been made a 1/4 inch thick as far as their bodies went, but these were actually reduced by about 25%. There was a top and a bottom shell that were bolted together in the middle to actually form the body, just the same as the street cars were made. Now, Cycolac could be prepped and painted like any metal surface, so Winfield worked his magic. And the final shade of the car was called lemon gold, and it blended around the interesting curves and angles of the machine perfectly. The Piranha Funny car was an absolutely stunning looker. Painted, loaded up, and ready to race, the car weighed 1,540 pounds. It was light. It sat 65 inches wide, 148 inches long, and the most cool dimension of this whole thing is the fact that it was only 39.5 inches tall to the top of the roll bar. The car was one of the most unique-looking funny cars of all time, capturing the essence of a Can-Am road racer, along with the awesome brutality of a nitro-powered drag racing weapon. But was this actually a funny car? And I say that it was for the simple fact that at this time in history, it was still the wild west of ideas and concepts in drag racing, so there were not many guidelines or guardrails to follow. Additionally, AMT wanted this thing to be a promotional tool. It was going to be a match racing beast, not some conforming national event runner. So knowing what we know now about back-motored funny cars and machines of this ilk in the 1960s and how sketchy and weird they could get, did the Piranha actually work? Oh, heck yes, it did. Debuting in June of 1966, the car, on its first day after a slow shakedown pass by Walt Stevens, then ran 881 at 182 miles an hour. And if you're wondering why this is significant, it made the Piranha the fastest full-bodied car in the history of drag racing to this point. Now, is it a full-bodied car? I suppose if it had to be compared to a dragster, it is. If you had to compare it to a superstock car, maybe not so much. Either way, they seized on this opportunity for promotion. And yes, that big speed certainly worked wonders for the marketing department. It also worked well for the booking agencies for the tracks. Walt, Joe, and the boys ran the wheels off this car on a relentless match racing tour to promote the road-going versions of the Piranha that AMT was gearing up to build in volume. Through the summer, the car appeared at strips all over the country, and the numbers kept dropping in elapsed time and elevating in speed. Early in the summer, the car was regularly running 820 to 830 at over 190 miles per hour. And all of a sudden, there was a legitimate chance that this thing would actually be the first funny car to break 200, and that in and of itself is a whole controversy probably worthy of its own video. Now, ultimately, in the hands of Walt Stevens and the rest of the crew, the car ran a best of 808 at 193 before closing the 1966 tour. There's no real record of race wins, but the reality is that in the wham-bam world of match racing like these guys are in, it was about getting the crowd whipped up, getting paid, and making the next show. Winning was fun, winning was a good brag, but the promotional element was their end goal. Now, many reports say that the car was lent to Don Cook and Connie Swingle in late '66 after the match racing tour for them to try to make it run 200 miles per hour. There are claims of the car running 197, and they do seem accurate to me, but there is one part of the funny car story that has been widely inaccurately reported over the course of the decades, and that's the fact that the car didn't race in 1967. According to the newspaper reports of the day, it sure did. The car hit the road in '67 with Connie Swingle as the driver, but it was only for a short time in the spring, because this was about the time something else was happening. AMT canceled the Streetcar Piranha program. Despite the good publicity they got from road racing, drag racing, and Gene Winfield's ability to get a Piranha on the popular TV show The Man from U.N.C.L.E., this was a car the lead character drove in several episodes, the actual AMT Piranha program was a massive flop. The company was trying to sell the cars for $5,000 a piece, and they were actually more expensive than that to build. Add in the fact that Chevrolet said they'd not be able to continue supplying Corvair drivetrains, and a complete lack of interest from the buying public, and this thing was over. So a handful of cars had been completed. 4 additional cars that were in process were finished and actually sent to Marbon Plastics, which I'm guessing was in lieu of payment, and they were promptly rebadged by Marbon as CRVs, and the company sent them to different places around the country. In 1969, the AMT Custom Equipment Division closed when someone in the accounting department no doubt realized that this fever dream of a cash drain was not helping the bottom line. Incredibly, almost all of the CRVs and Piranhas ever built are somehow accounted for. There were between 12 and 15 total cars built, with 10 to 12 known to exist in some form or another. The road racing Piranha was restored about 20 years ago and competes regularly in vintage road racing events. The funny car changed hands a couple of times, ultimately ending up with Don Garlitz, who restored the car fully, and it sits on display in his awesome museum as a testament to one of the most awesome machines that ever attacked the quarter mile in the decades of the 1960s. Today, most of your modern commuter car is made of ABS plastic in some form. Whether it's the bumper cover or the dashboard or even the fenders, Marbon had the right idea and they knew it. Now, the sales tactic was a little out there, but hey, if we're still talking about it 60 years later, it must have been effective. As for the success of the AMT Piranha funny car, it was featured in virtually every auto magazine you can think of when it was built. I found 8 magazine features alone in my collection in everything from Rod and Custom to popular hot rodding, hot rod, drag strip, high-performance cars, car life, and more. There was a huge bonanza of publicity from AMT and Marbon, and somehow the plastic company won that round. Also, here's an interesting footnote. Of the 8 features I located personally in all of those different magazines, one guy wrote 7 of them. And to his credit, they're all slightly different in their narrative. Wayne Toms was either the most industrious freelancer of his era or a dude who gambled and won, hoping the other magazine editors didn't speak to each other about running the same car, the same month, written by the same guy. And the amount of money Wayne must have made creating all these stories had to have been hilarious for him over the course of a 3-month period in late 1966. So there's the story of the Piranha, one of the 1960s most awesome experimental funny cars, and frankly, one of the most successful in its short lifespan. The rigid and well-engineered chassis of Fred Smith allowed Walt Stevens to really let it fly in this car, and right until the end, Stevens maintained that it was one of the best cars he ever drove. It was stable, it was fast, it was fun. He even called it a Cadillac. So next time someone drops a photo of this sucker on the internet, you can school them on all of its goodness, interesting history, and a whole lot more. I'm Brian Loans. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more nitro, historical, racing, gearhead, plastic, automotive, and carbon fiber content.